question. So before we start, just quickly, how many musicians do we have in the crowd today? Yes, yes. People that work in the music industry? People that love music? People that are currently supporting a musician? Okay, all right. Okay, we're going to dig in. So first things first, let's start with some introductions. So let's start on this end with Abe. Please tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Abe Claiborne. I'm now currently the Chief Creative Officer for CoStellar, which is a finance company for creative entrepreneurs.
Hey, I'm Dominic Cortese. I am a musician. I'm married to a ceramic artist, a small business owner, and a tax preparer and tax advisor that specializes in creative people and businesses.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Joleen Hughes, and I am a former band manager and rock promoter, and now I am a lawyer who has my own law firm, and we specialize in helping all businesses, including all creative businesses, do their legal stuff.
Great. Terry?
I'm Terry Morgan. My company's called Modern Enterprises. We'll celebrate our 45th year this next fall. We produce special events, concerts, festivals, whatever people ask us to do. I'm a musician, a bass player, play with Leroy Bell, and I'm on the Washington State Arts Commission and the Seattle Music Commission.
You're a busy man. And more to come. So let's think about what is the sort of pipeline, or what is the trajectory? So you start playing music in your basement or your bedroom or in, wherever that may be. And at some point you start playing live, and at some point you start thinking, oh, well, I'd like to try and do this for a living, or somebody just offered me money to play a show, this sort of thing. So why don't we first talk about, like, in your guys' opinion, and maybe I'll start with you, Terry, as an artist manager, at what point do you start thinking about something like this as a professional thing rather than just something you do for fun? And where do you think that point starts? Or is it you think that from the first note you should be thinking about being professional?
I think first you master your craft. You have to be good. You have to have something that you can present in public that you're proud of and you think that people will enjoy. I think that's the thing that people kind of overlook. It's not just a game show or a soap opera or some kind of reality event. You really have to be creative and you have to make a statement. You can play covers. You can be great at a cover band. A lot of people make a great living as a cover band. But if you want to be in the independent music world or taken seriously as an artist, you've got to have something to say. Awesome.
So Joleen, as a lawyer, I mean, often what time are you starting to work with artists? Like when, you're not necessarily negotiating a deal for them to go play a single show at the Sunset Tavern or, the Vera Project. Where does an artist usually start engaging you?
I like to do what I call sort of 101 sessions, where artists will come in and meet with me and get a whole broad sweep of all the things that they might need to look at. And that can be anything from setting up maybe a company if they want to do that, to how to allocate your songwriting and start doing that early, which is really important, to really understanding sort of how to negotiate maybe those deals so you can do it on yourself. I like to empower artists to learn about the business so they can do some of it on their own and then be there for when there's some sort of wonky negotiation, or let's say they get signed to a record deal or publishing deal. Those are things that you would really want a lawyer to look at, but it's important to understand and cut through sort of the myths versus the reality of some of the legal / business terms.
So I'd maybe ask you, Joleen, or Dominic, or Abe, why do you need to form a company? Like, what is the benefit of forming a company around your business as opposed to just doing it as an individual?
I'll start from the legal side. If you don't own anything, you don't own any property, or don't have anything that you're scared to lose, people think, oh, I don't need to form a company. But for instance, if you have a band, sometimes the band forms its own entity. If you have songs, you can form an entity and keep the songs in that entity. But what it actually does is I think two things, and Dominic can talk to the financial part of it, but it gets you in the mindset that if you're trying to make money from this, that it's separate from maybe your waiter gig or whatever gig you are to sort of pay the bills, but you're taking it seriously as a business if you want it to be a business. But it also sets you up to be organized in a way that does protect your assets from other people. It's a deeper concept, but you really don't want your personal assets to be subject to, say, somebody taking them away. Like if you got into a wreck, say, if you're going on a tour and you hurt somebody, like you don't want them to come after you personally. So if you keep assets in an entity, then that protects you from that kind of liability and lawsuits. So that's one main reason.
Are you talking specifically about an LLC?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think some people...
And so just one second, can you just say what an LLC is
Yeah.
for those that might not know?
A limited liability company, which is something that protects you from losing your personal assets, which is kind of what Joleen is talking about.
A lot of people kind of form what are called de facto partnerships, which means you're all sort of doing something in a common way. And the tax implications of partnerships and the legal implications of partnerships can be unexpected. And there's this concept legally called joint and several liability. So if you're partners with people and say your partner does something wrong, you can be jointly and severally liable for what they do. So that's another reason why having an LLC kind of gives you a shield about that. But there are some operational aspects to that, which Dominic can speak to for sure.
So Dominic, I mean, in your world as working with accounting and taxes and stuff, so are there benefits that artists can have by having a separate business entity, or can you claim losses in one part of your world as a musician versus your day job being a bartender or a barista or something like that?
Sure, yeah. Essentially, the way I look at it and kind of the way the federal government looks at it is that as soon as you are making more than $400 at, let's say you're a musician, you're making more than $400 in a year, and you're pursuing music, you're trying to make more money every year and make that your business, you are a business. There's no setting up any kind of entity, you just are. And you file your taxes that way. So it's good to, when you go into the process of playing shows, if you feel like this is something you want to do, whether you know for sure or not, that's like a good starting point right there to start organizing yourself, to save your receipts, to look at, do I have a home office? Am I traveling to and from gigs? Is there mileage I can take? The mindset of I am a business, I think, should start almost immediately when you start playing shows and you think you're going to play maybe more than one or two a year kind of thing. And again, that threshold really technically is $400. If you're going to make that in a year, you should consider yourself a business. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, and also as far as earnings from royalties, there are certain tranches of royalties you do not have access to unless you are a company. So you can't even sign up to receive those royalties without being a company.
Right.
So.
Dominic, real quick, can we just do like a speed round sort of thing? So let's just talk about some of the things that are deductible for musicians. So services, like if you hired a publicist or something like that to work on a record, would something like that be?
Yeah, any service that you hire for your business. If you want to speak to a lawyer, that time is deductible. If you pay out a certain amount of money to a manager, that's also deductible. If you go to a show, not all shows that you go to, like if you go see Pearl Jam, you can't deduct that. But if you go to the Sunset and see people who are in your scene, that's a networking cost, and that's one that people often miss. So that's also deductible against your income. If you're meeting up with somebody who plays in another band to have a beer or a meal and you guys are talking about your music, that's deductible as well.
Now, what about, so travel, obviously, if you're going back and forth to a gig or something like that. Now, what about if I need to go to the desert for like a week to get inspiration to write a song? Is that Is that deductible, or is that sounds like a vacation, right?
A lot of it is if you have to ask yourself, do I have an argument for this? If you go to the desert to rent out a cabin and you work on songwriting for 4 days and that's what you're there to do, and you do that for 8 hours a day, heck yes, that is deductible. If you take part of that time and you go to an amusement park for half the day, you got to think about that. And maybe so you're only deductible 3.5 days. But yeah, when you're engaging and if your business is trying to grow and that's part of growing your business, then that is an expense and you should be able to take that.
Last question in this thing. Is clothing, are the clothes that I buy to wear on stage deductible?
If you only wear them on stage and you save them for being on stage, then yes, they are. If they are clothes that you'll wear out on a regular day basis, no.
So if the world is my stage, I can't deduct everything I wear?
Unfortunately not.
So
That's fairly recent, though. That's actually fairly recent.
Oh, that the world was my stage, or that
No, just
you can't
that
deduct?
when I first started, you could deduct clothes, but that law changed over time. So when you have a good accountant, you'll know like all these different nuances that come up.
And they might come back too. Taxes are always changing.
So Abe, I'm curious. And maybe you can tell a little bit about what CoStellar does or what you folks are aspiring to do. But I assume that if you're getting into loaning money to support creative projects, that's going to be more to a company than to an individual, or not? Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes. So, our mission at CoStellar is to provide funding, kind of like Sonic Guild, to take to the next level. But we use what we call a lending and learning model. So we educate as well as loan money. And we look for people that are at a certain threshold to do that. And we're not necessarily using credit scores or any of those traditional models for loaning capital. We're using what we call character-based lending. And it's based on if you have a business, because the commercial loans are different than personal loans. They have different rules that we have to follow and such. So we would ideally want anyone working with CoStellar to form a business, and that way we can educate them on all the ways that they can maximize their earnings, as well as financial literacy, working with tax people, working with lawyers, to help them, to set them up for success. A lot of times there's just a gap. There's a long arc to the creative process. So there's just a gap of when you create that thing and then when it gets into the market. And we're trying to help bridge that gap for artists with, we are technically a for-profit company, but we're trying to do it as non-extractive as possible and getting low-cost money, low interest rates, or no interest rate loans over time. And we want to work with you. We actually want to be partners more than, we're not just a bank. We want to partner with each of our customers and help them achieve their financial goals.
I'm curious, and maybe Dominic could jump in here as well. So if somebody was to get a loan from you folks, are there parts of that that's deductible, whether it be interest or things like that? And I guess I would apply that this is one sort of model for fundraising for musicians and things like that. But if you do like a GoFundMe or something like that, are you responsible for paying taxes on the money that people bring to the table?
Sure. So for the loan in particular, the interest you pay would be deductible as an expense. For GoFundMes and other crowdsourcing platforms, if you are not offering anything to the people who donate, and you're just saying, I'm trying to do this thing in my life, my creative life, and I would love your donations, and they donate out of the goodwill of their heart, then no, that you don't have to report that income. If you are offering anything as a reward, then yes, that is included as income. But the things that you are offering, let's say you donate $20 and you get a free record, and that record costs me or is retailed at $10, then that's a $10 expense that I can take against that. So there's a number of different factors, but generally, if you're offering something to those donees or donators, then it's taxable income.
Awesome. So Terry, let me ask you, as an artist manager, how do you talk to people about? I should take a step back. We've all heard the horror stories of people making some money and then finding out that they're owe a shit ton of money all of a sudden to the government. So how do you work with your artists to try to manage that so they don't get stuck at the end of the year having to write a big check? Or do you not?
All I can do is advise, because as management, you don't have any control over what the artist actually does. So you can suggest to them that they set up an LLC, issue W-9s, 1099s, the whole thing. Most people don't do that. And somebody gets stuck with the tax bill at the end of the year.
Right. Because it seems like most venues these days are issuing W-2 at the end, right? Is it a W-2 or W-9?
W-9s.
W-9 at the end of
Yeah.
the year. And so whether it's people sign for that as an individual or your business sign for it, somebody's paying the taxes on that money.
Yeah, there's no way to escape that chain. Every dollar is accountable unless it's cash. And even then, as an accountant,
It's supposed to be accountable.
yes. It's tricky because CD sales, hardly anybody reports CD sales as income. All that money usually just goes right back into the artist's gas fund or new strings or new guitars.
When you say that, you just mean like stuff you're
Merch.
selling at the
Yeah.
gig itself.
Only the venues that enforce a tax actually are the ones collecting the money at the point of sale.
Well, and are you talking about that as a cash transaction? Like, because it seems like a lot of people are using like Venmo or other electronic-based things where there's a record of the transaction.
Yeah, Venmo and PayPal, any of those kind of things are directly related to your bank account and your social security number and will get traced. That's not free money.
Well, this kind of also goes into another benefit of having an LLC or some sort of entity, is that if everybody signs an agreement, it's called an operating agreement for an LLC. Corporations are not usually done for artists, but assuming we're talking about LLCs, an operating agreement can then designate people to play roles. So you can have someone who is managing the money, somebody who's marketing and promotion. You have ways to like bring band members in and out. There's all sorts of things you can do with that kind of document. So you would want to work with a lawyer to advise you on all those ways. We don't have time to get into all of them. But when it comes to things like setting up PayPal accounts or setting up the bank accounts for the band, a lot of bands, they do designate one person who is in charge. And then that one person gets really nailed with taxes and all sorts of challenges. And I don't think that people talk about that a lot, but that's happened in almost every band I've ever worked with at some point.
Yes. How important do you think it is, and I'll put this out to the general group, to try to create a general level of financial awareness amongst all the members? Because I've found in different bands I've been at different points, people have different understandings of how stuff works, and they're all of a sudden, why are you doing that? Or why is that money being taken? And it's sort of like, no, this is why we keep the IRS from, I don't know. That's a statement more than a question, I guess. My shadow is coming out. So do you advise, what about with your clients? Do you advise them to try to pay their taxes quarterly or to the end of the year, or?
I always do, if possible, because I think I work with clients in all different creative endeavors, and there's always that moment in everybody's life where they get where they make money for the first time, and then they get hit with it's called a self-employment tax, generally. And it's affiliated with the entity, and that can be divvied up amongst all the people that are members of the entity, but it can be very jarring, and you want to really look after your money. Dominic can probably tell you more, but it's the thing that I find that most creative people are least interested in, but it's the thing they should most learn about.
I'm jumping around here a little bit, Joleen, but do you ever take an active role in helping a group of creatives that work together figure out how they're going to split up the pot of money if money comes over the threshold?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of artists have different philosophies on that too. Like, for instance, there are some, let's just use a band of 4 people. Some bands, they will split up, say, songwriting and all the different royalties equally to keep the harmony within the band. Other bands are more, there's very distinct songwriters and composers, and so there's a weighted difference. So it's really, everybody is different, and everybody, you have to kind of go through some of these things. And there might be strengths and weaknesses in the different members, and some people can be in charge of different things, and you can allocate all of those in a document that allows you to all understand what your role is, which is kind of helpful from the onset. So,
but it becomes a very complex marriage that
They all do.
It's totally undefined because every relationship in a 5-way or a 6-way band is completely different. And nobody has the same understanding like a couple would have where they reach mutual agreement. Band, everybody has their own set of priorities. Like the drummer most likely is never going to get a songwriting royalty unless he's really prolific. And oftentimes the drummer is the guy who quits first because he gets cut out of the deal. And when you go to sign a record deal, luckily, if the band is united enough, everyone gets signed to the deal. Otherwise, it's just the songwriters that get signed to the deal.
So you have to have a way to get in and out if you're going to sign an agreement.
From a kernel of knowledge for everybody here, is it better to have those conversations before there's money or after there's money?
Well, also, like, fundamentally, what is your philosophy? Like, there's artists that don't want to tour, for instance, and like if other artists in the band want to tour, that could be a fundamental problem. Like maybe one or more have families and they don't want to leave their families and go on the road. And so it's not just about money, it's about really like what are our long-term goals? Because you're right, it's like a marriage amongst however many people rather than 2. And so you have to keep those going and I think by putting legal structure into place, even if it's sort of a light legal structure, it maybe gives some boundaries that you can put into place, which you can maybe use to help guide those decisions rather than make them personal. Because I think that's the thing that, at least in my experience, it becomes really, really challenging because it is such a personal thing. You're creating art together. You're spending all this time together. And when there's disagreements, they're big disagreements. And sometimes, blows things up a lot. And you want to avoid that.
I was going to say, don't let this doom and gloom not inspire you to be creative. Because the most important thing is to get that energy out of yourself, make that statement, have fun with your friends, and entertain somebody, make somebody happy. The legal stuff and the business stuff will always get in the way, but become a creative entity before you even get serious about writing up letters of agreement to become an LLC, because that could be a deal breaker right there.
So I would ask the whole panel, and Abe, you come from a publishing background in some ways. Can you have any suggestions about what's a good way to facilitate that conversation about splits or things like that can be done, again, before when you're not arguing once you have a hit record or something like that?
I tell people, songwriters, like, before you walk out of the studio that day, you all just agree on what that is. Write it down on a napkin. It doesn't even matter, just so there's something. But just as the song, at the point of creation is the best time to do that. Later down the road, like Joleen said earlier, selective memory comes in. It's like, well, I was humming that next door and you heard me. So you want to avoid any of those kind of things. So.
Dominic?
I think a good strategy is to start simple. So when you're like getting started with a group and you're in that initial portion of part of inspiration and excitement, it's okay to have a small conversation. That's something that's lightly in writing, an email or something on a napkin, just something you can all start with. And I think a really good way to do it is just to say, we're all going to split this evenly to start. And you kind of write that in an email. And then you can have lots of conversations about that, and you should be having lots of conversations about your career as you move forward. So you start and you guys are all on the same page and you start there. And then you get to the next step and you say, we need to have another conversation. And as long as everybody's on the same page with having those conversations and being open to that, I think that is enough. Enough being on the same page as you need at that moment. And it's also an exciting thing to say, we're going to talk about this more as we get bigger. And that's maybe when you also down the line want to talk to a professional to help guide you into those conversations. But don't feel like you have to have the financials figured out before you start being creative. I think.
Without putting you on the spot, because you're a musician as well, do those splits or things change in how you song to song, or do you guys just have a general agreement in terms of, or you can speak in the abstract as well, it doesn't need to be. We don't need to get into Warren Dune's P&L sheet and figure out exactly what's going on there.
Yeah. Well, we have had many conversations about it. I'm in a little bit different of a situation in that I'm in a band with my family. So we're all related. It's my brother and his wife and I are best friends. And so we've decided to split things pretty evenly. But, there are opportunities where, let's say, Julia, the lead singer, will go and do a run of shows herself. Those are conversations we have. It's not a big deal to have those conversations to say, okay, I'm going on tour and I'm taking all of this money, and that's my personal money. And those conversations are not intimidating because we're having them on a consistent basis when anything like that comes up. We're not afraid to have those conversations because that has been a part of our history. And so it smooths everything out. So again, as long as you are starting off on the same page and I think deciding that we're going to have conversations as we go along, that can really make the whole process a lot easier and no one's feelings get hurt. And it can all change as you progress through things. But that's the way we approach it, kind of one major situation at a time.
That's really positive. Joleen or Abe, maybe just for those that don't know. So let's say you decide on splits for a song. We decide that the five of us write a song together. We decide it's an equal split amongst all of us. Does that stay that way for the perpetuity of the song? Or at some point, could I sell you my shares? Or could you claim that you wrote it, without getting into litigation? Just, is it forever, or how does that work?
Well, these are all agreements you can make, and like you said, you can go in and out of agreements. But one of the things to bear in mind is that under the Copyright Act, if you're jointly creating something, you need to have it in writing to actually prove it. So this is part of the Copyright Act. This allows, there's some just concepts under copyright, which means if you jointly write something, if you don't have it in writing of how you're able to then, the word is exploit, like put it out there to the world, that means everybody has equal right to do all of it. And so if you're not on the same page later and you all own it equally, it's not just about what royalties do we take, but what are we allowed to do with it? And are we shopping it to a label? Are we getting a publishing deal? That sort of thing. So that's a really important concept, that it has to be in writing or it will default to equal to everybody. So if you want it to be different, you should put it in writing.
Yeah. And there are a lot of times recently where a single writer is selling off his share of his entire catalog. And so that changes, that definitely will change the dynamic of everything when you have, BlackRock, private equity owns 30% of your song, you have, they operate very differently than your bandmate would, so.
Especially when it comes time to clear these songs. Like,
Right.
I mean, I recently was working on a documentary for a musician that's very famous, who sold their publishing.
Yes.
And they're talking about, we want to allow you to use all the songs in the documentary. And then they're like, but now I don't control it anymore because I sold it. And then there's there's probably, 40 songs that they were considering and different different people own different parts of it, and they didn't have everything written down. And so when you fast forward later, if you're not organized up front, it can cause problems later. And there's lots of examples of bands that get in big, huge fights after they've broken up later. And again, it's the memory issue. Everybody seems to embellish their contribution as things age. So
Awesome. Another question seems to come up a lot when through Sonic Hill we're talking with emerging musicians in our community, and oftentimes they're like, "We just need to get a manager. We just need to get a manager." I'd be curious, to the group, when do you think getting a manager is a good thing, or when does it really help? And as a manager, what can you bring to the table more than what the artist potentially is doing on their own to begin with?
Well, first off, I suggest artists manage themselves until they're not capable of dealing with the business. They need to learn the steps and the procedure and the relationship aspect of the industry more than anything else, because a manager can only do so much for you. All they can do is advise. It's up to the artist to make the ultimate decision whether they take the gig, whether they want the record deal, whether they go on tour, whether they want to fire somebody in the band. It becomes a labor of love to be a manager, because you only make a percentage of what the artist makes. So if the artist doesn't make any money, you're working for years not making a dime. And it's really challenging, especially when you believe in the artist, but you just can't move forward. So it's always good to seek out advice. I think that events like this are really positive for artists to come to, because you have a set of resources now that you can tap. All of us are available in the public, and Ben is always here. So
Yeah, every day. I sweep up on the weekend.
yeah, so don't be afraid to ask. I think people are fearful of the industry because the industry can eat you up, but you have to set your own goals and parameters and accomplish the things that you know you can do, right? And set those goals and pursue them. Say you want to play the showbox. Well, make that a goal. Work towards that. Learn the people. Learn who books the showbox.
One tip I'll say is that, as an artist, nothing's harder than to put yourself out there and have somebody say no or say they don't like it. And one trick is just create whatever your artist name is / blah, 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 manager@gmail.com or whatever, and just send that an email, and you'll find it's much easier to know what's going on when the agent's like, yep, not going to book them. They're not drawing this, that, or the other thing, as opposed to, or yes, I totally want them, we had another artist that said they did that and they saw their offers go up like 25% once they had this manager email rather than them as persons. So it's hard to separate the business from the personal when it comes to creation, but there are different tricks we can try to do to, like the tapping,
I
our previous
love that.
panel, like the affirmation.
But why I love that is because, again, another thing, this is maybe sort of a legal business tip, is that the more you keep control of what you own, your songs, your email addresses, things like that, if you create those ahead of time, like manager@gmail or whatever, and you keep access to that, then let's say you switch managers. You're not worried about like, oh my gosh, all these emails went to some other account. Right. You own it. And that goes for anyone in the creative industry. I think a lot of influencers are sort of, that's kind of the new thing right now. But that's something I'm seeing a lot of. Like, you want to keep control over everything about your business as much as you can.
Very cool. Abe, I'm curious, with the work that you're doing, supporting artists or through grants or through loans and stuff like that. When you're talking to artists, like what are the sort of needs that they're most trying to fill, and where do you think that line is where people should engage? Where they feel like they can get the return on a loan versus potentially defaulting or having to bankrupt your LLC or something like that.
The way we're looking at it, especially with musicians in particular, is that you've created IP, your intellectual property, your music that you've created over the history now has value because of streaming and other sources. And so we look at the overall value of you as an artist. And depending on what that threshold is, I know that most artists are only collecting about 60% of the royalties they're due. I would say 80% of artists are not collecting their royalties because it's a complex web of, regulations and red tape. And so we know that, but we also know how to get that money. So we can look at an artist and say, okay, there are companies that do similar work, but they set thresholds like, oh, if you have 10,000 followers on Spotify, then you qualify for money, but you have to give up, all your rights to us. We'll hold those rights. We're coming at it a different way where we're looking at the value of you as an artist and betting on your future. And we're not so much worried about defaults because we, have done the work. We have helped you maximize your earnings. And there is a historical precedent. So streaming alone, you make $500 a year. We know that. So we know for the next 5 years or 3 years, you're going to make X amount of money. And if we help you gain 40% more, you're going to make $800 a year. So we can bet on that process. It's more so how we're looking at it. So the threshold and the type of loan, because we do different ones, is going to really depend on the artist. So we're actually going to work hand in hand with the artists. So like I said, be their partners. So we're not just a bank. And, I think our frustration is that all the artists we talk to, they're like, oh, I just put my whole studio on a credit card.
Right.
Which drives me nuts, right? You're going to pay 21% when you technically could go to BCU. I know you don't think you could, but you technically could if you were set up as a business. And they would probably give you a loan for that process. But they're just so terrified of that loan process, right? And traditional banks usually don't give access to creative projects. But so this is why we're kind of laser focused on the creative economy in this situation. So.
Well, the interesting thing I think about the creative world, no matter what discipline it is there has to be an element of magical thinking, or you would never do anything, right? But where do you find that delta between magical thinking of if I get that loan, I'm going to have a platinum record next year from the studio. So when you're vetting things to think about it, like what you mentioned, some companies use Spotify or Spotify View or things, Instagram, different stuff like that. What sort of things are you taking into account to judge whether you think support from you guys could really move the ball forward for a client?
Yeah, well, we look at, for music, we look at historical streams, plays, touring, sales. We look at the artist holistically, but then we also look at the band as people. So it's called character-based assessment. I'm not going to go through our whole matrix, but there's certain things we have to look at how likely this band is going to break up. You have to look at
Historically, more than likely.
and if so, who's going to be responsible? We have to look at, okay, they've been a band for 5 years. They seem fine. We like to meet them in person kind of thing. And then is what they intend to use the money for, even if we don't restrict or anything, but their intent of the money, is that wise? Are they I need a new outfit for the stage. Can I get $10,000? We might not think that's the right way to use $10,000, right? So it's kind of a mixture of those types of things. But we're also doing visual artists and arts organizations as well. We're bridge funding and just cash flow gaps plague every type of business. But in the creative businesses, cash flow gaps are hard. I need to go on tour, but I need to do all this stuff to go on tour.
I was just going to ask that. How many people have gone on tour and had to think about fronting all the money for the T-shirts or the merchandise before you go,
right,
and the sort of hardship that can be? That you need that to make money on tour, but you might not have the $2,500 to pay for it all.
Right. And so we think, And that's measurable. You're like, okay, you have 20 dates. On your last tour, you sold 5 shirts per show. We can calculate on a rough means, like, okay, you sold 5 shirts per show, you're doing 5 more shows. We could say, oh, well, this is how much money you probably need. There you go.
Do you do any advising, like, that's an ugly shirt and that will not sell on tour?
No, we don't make any judgments in that way. Like, we actually don't judge on genre, or we don't care, like, if you're popular with the kids, or like, that's not our consideration.
You're not a manager.
No, not a manager. Like, it can be classical. Like, we're not genre based. We're just, if you're in the creative space and you have a project that creates value for the community and intrinsically is valuable, art is valuable.
I'm just curious. You mentioned that oftentimes artists you're talking to are only accessing. Did you say it was 60% of their revenue?
Basically.
Where do you think they're missing usually?
Okay.
Not to put you on the spot.
There is, in the industry, they have separated music rights into 2 sides. There's the master side, and then there's the songwriter publishing side. Within that, there are 3 or 4 organizations that are set up to collect that on your behalf, and it's your job to collect that from them, right? ASCAP and BMI, we have Sound Exchange. But with streaming going global, there's also what they call neighboring rights. And the royalty systems work different around the world. Most artists are not collecting, like, oh man, I got played in Finland, that's cool. Spotify is only giving you about 65 when they cut you a check. The rest of it's sitting over there waiting, and you have to engage with certain organizations as a songwriter and as a publisher. So you have to you're your own entity. So labels are already set up this way, but if you're just self-releasing, you have to be the songwriter, and you have to be the publisher, and you have to be the master controller. Most people just like, I'm the songwriter, I'm the artist, but they never sign up as the publisher, because the publisher share, like on Sound Exchange, when you get play on radio, the artist, songwriter share is 15%. The publisher share is 70%, and 5% goes to administration. So it's like 70%. If you ever get played on KXP and they pay a royalty, 70% of that is going nowhere.
And do you think that most people assume that if they're putting their music through DistroKid or CD Baby or one of these aggregators, that they will just kind of take care of all that? Or?
Yeah, but only all the distributors are actually a little different. If you really get into the mechanics of how they work, like, there are certain distributors that you have to go through to get on the jukeboxes in bars. There's only 3 distributors that distributes to jukeboxes. Now, DistroKid is usually not one of them, but there's other distributors to get your song played in-store music. There's only certain distributors they accept. So every distributor is not the same. So these are the things we can teach you how to be careful and make sure, like, depending on your goals, your genre, your market, how to attack that and grow that revenue.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
We've got about 10 minutes left with this session. I'd love to open it up for some Q&A if you folks have questions. If not, I can keep queuing them up to these folks. But you must be thinking, well, how does this affect what I'm doing?
What are a couple of the most common things that you're providing loans to artists for? And what are some of the more common things that are requested that you're like, no, not for that?
Well, we are just getting started. We're a startup, and we're raising capital. But the most, we've done surveys and we've talked to the community, and most of the time it's actually for hard goods, as we call it. It's merch, T-shirt. We need a van. We need new speakers. We need new amps. It's usually those kind of costs, especially pressing vinyl. Is a lot of requests because it depending on the run, it can be pretty expensive up front. A lot of that.
Thank you. I've been running our band as a sole proprietorship, and I think I'm probably getting to a point where I need to become an LLC. Is there like a time frame within? It's probably coming up on about 3 years now, and definitely we've made some money, but not as much as we spent. So I just kind of want to make sure I don't fall into that owing a ton of taxes. I've taken some deductions, but I'm just wondering, like, now's probably the time to do LLC, and I don't know, maybe you covered
If you
that
think
in the
it's
beginning.
time, it's time.
I mean, I think that if you feel comfortable with the people and you know you're going to be working together, or, an LLC doesn't have to be more than one person. You can have a solo LLC. If you're a sole proprietorship, I would 100% convert that to an LLC.
And that won't change your tax situation
No.
at all. Only becoming a multi-member
Yeah.
LLC, which defaults into a partnership, will
Right.
change your tax situation.
Let me ask you, using his model, though, if he's been doing this for 3 years, can you retroactively file expenses or losses, or it's basically if that tax year is closed, you can't go back and claim stuff retroactively?
You can amend your taxes. Yeah, absolutely, for 3 years.
Thank you very much.
So he's asking, can you go from a sole proprietorship to an LLC retroactively and claim that?
That's
You
a
do
great.
whatever you're set up as.
Yeah, it's a good question, but again, unless you're choosing a multi-member LLC, it won't change your tax situation at all. Yeah.
Great. Right here?
My question is, if you have investors who are investing money for you guys to then give out as loans, and this could go for you with Sonic Guild too, what happens with the money when it's sitting there? Do you guys invest it in a money market account or in some other fund so that it doesn't depreciate?
Have you heard of DraftKings?
That's funny.
Yes, that's actually part of our model. So the whole premise behind Costello is to make a sustainable way of giving money and basically recycling it through. And there's a certain threshold of capital you need that we will earn money from the money that sits invested that then funds our operations. Then we can just recycle that money. And when it comes back in, we can just put it back out. We just have to reach a certain threshold of cash, which I won't talk about right now. But yes, so we do just invest it and use the interest earned as operating capital.
Great. Yes, right here.
I'm going to ask a leading question. When do you advise bands to start, if you do at all, to start like a business development budget for themselves as part of their LLC development, to start to set money aside to keep developing the band as part of the plan for each year?
I would say from the very beginning, I always, if I'm just advising the band and they're not making much money, I always say, don't split that money up, reinvest that money back into promotion, into product, into something that's going to become profitable for you, or at least become a tool. The problem that everyone has is thinking that you're going to get rich, and it doesn't happen.
It happens just often enough that people think it can happen. But yeah.
You can
Happened to a few artists in
Yeah,
Seattle.
a few artists. But, you look at the number of bands from Seattle that can sell out Climate Pledge. What is it?
5, maybe?
Maybe.
What do you mean, like from here?
Yeah.
Five or six.
And we are a music city. We have very prolific artists that produce all kinds of great music, but the economics of the industry work against you. If you get to a certain level, your touring costs eat up 90% of the income that you're making off of the date. Everyone's talking about the money that Ticketmaster's making. Well, the bands are making even less because it's not cheap to be out there, especially the larger tour that you have. You have an entourage of even 20 people. Hotels alone will cost you a couple of grand a night just to go from town to town. A bus alone, what's a bus cost these days? $1,400 to $2,000 a day?
Yeah, something like depends
Something
on
like
the bus.
that.
Yeah.
The driver. And then, the room for the driver.
Yeah,
on top.
room for the driver on top and meals. Everything costs. So your best bet is to think small. What can I do for the least amount of money that's going to move me forward? And then you can become successful and put that money back into, like I said, reinvest it back into the band, make things happen, improve your equipment, get yourself a van, move on, and keep it a DIY kind of project until things start to blow up. And then you can start putting money in your pocket.
I think bands are like startups. Like, you talk about startups, and I wrote a blog about this years ago. And the concepts are the same. The more you can keep it lean and tight for as long as possible, it gives you, again, the moral authority, and it gives you sort of the chops to be able to sort of understand where you want to invest and not invest. And you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to learn from them. And you have to. I think everybody should do that. You're not going to go through life like this and not make some mistakes, but that's okay too.
Yeah. The way I kind of interpret that question is budgeting. When do we talk about budgeting? And I think a good, is a good strategy that I've found recently with my projects is album cycles. Start thinking in album cycles, because you start that process, you write, then you record, then you promote, then you release, then you tour, and that's the album cycle. All right, basic album cycle. So you can think about a lot of the processes, a lot of the costs, how you want things to be split up, what your goals are at the start of that process. And that's like a good start and end kind of period. And I found works for us.
Yes. Other questions? We got time for maybe one more. All right, let's do maybe closing thoughts that, we've put a lot of information out there. Sometimes we think about the business, as you were saying, more than the art. I think let's just talk a little bit about communication, because it seems like so much of the stuff that we've talked about today has been about how do you find ways to work with the people you're creating with and manage it if you're lucky enough that the business goes to that level. So let's start with you, Terry, as an artist manager. I know you've worked with quite a number of personalities over the year. What keeps people together and what breaks them up? What, in your experience with that?
Well, what keeps them together is you've got to be friends. You can't have a bad apple in the band. It just doesn't work.
People don't get less annoying over time.
No, they just hone their craft. But as long as you're having fun, do what you want to do. Make your music for yourself. But make it something that you think somebody else might enjoy also. Create an affinity group of your friends who become your fans, who bring in more people, and things will grow. You don't have to be playing in the clubs all the time. You can have a little side gig doing house concerts that becomes very lucrative. You can be in a cover band and guarantee that you're going to make some money every weekend. You can just play for yourself and record and release your products online. There's so many different ways that you can be prolific and successful without actually even being seen in public. Look at all the musicians playing in the symphony or in the ballet or the opera. You don't know their names, but they're making damn good livings. So be open to what role you can play in the creative universe, not just as a musician. If you start designing posters, maybe you spin off a T-shirt manufacturing company or start designing for somebody else, or websites. Use all the skills that you learn in this industry to push yourself further in your own life.
How do you, Joleen, how do you advise? Unfortunately, I think when people engage you, sometimes it's at the point of conflict. But how do you advise folks to communicate and try to make it so that you're being additive to what they do as opposed to being a referee or something?
Well, as far as like what I do, I don't like conflict. I actually love bringing people together. That's why I wanted to be a lawyer. That's why I transitioned from being a manager and promoter to this role. But I think the thing that I've learned, and as I look back on my career and the iterations of my career, because I've known all of you guys for a really long time, But it's keeping really good relationships with everybody. Like, don't be. I don't. This isn't really asking the legal question, but I think
Okay.
that you're going to see people on the way up as you are on the way down. And I know that's sort of trite, but it's so true. And I think that the most meaningful part of my work in the industry is just the relationships I have with people, and how, when you develop that network, how you can literally call so many different people to be part of your inner circle, if you're just really kind and professional and grateful for all the opportunities. I like to use probably the most recent example for me, at least, of this is an artist you probably all know is Aaron Jones. And Aaron started in my pub years ago. He just played, we had a cover band, and he would just play the sort of intervals when he would take a break. And my husband called me down and said, "You got to see this kid play guitar." And I mean, he is the same now as he was playing in the pub as he is opening for the Rolling Stones. And I feel like that he, to me, is one of the most prolific examples of someone who is gathering his people, and the success we're seeing from him now is, even though it's taken him years and years, that's why. And I just really admire him for that.
Awesome. Dominic, you being in a band yourself, and family, that is a heavy lift, family and band all together. Communication, is that something that you really consciously think about how you do that? Or maybe just unpack that a little bit if you can.
Absolutely. I think something I mentioned before is things that have really worked for us is communicate often. Don't be afraid to work through hard situations. It can only make you stronger. It really can. And write things down. Email is a great way to do it, because then you can always go back to that, and you don't have to have conversations about who said what, when, where, and how, and the nuanced details. It's all just written out, and that really calms everybody's nerves, and that people are much more chill when we can all reflect back on a written document that we all agreed upon. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to take other people's an outside opinion. You can kind of think of the example of all the employees can rally together around hating the boss kind of thing. But you can all rally around an opinion easier if it's coming from an outside source. Like, well, how does this person say we should manage our budgeting? Or what does this person think should be our next single? It's a lot easier to have a constructive conversation about that opinion than it is sometimes when it's all internal. So I guess don't be afraid to let it out of your internal bubble. It can make you stronger, I think.
And Abe, we're going to finish up with you in terms of maybe just touch a little bit on, and you have a little bit, but the collaborative process. I mean, you're investing in people's success, right? You don't do what you do.
Right.
You're not selling a subprime housing loans or something like that.
Yeah. Even though we discussed that. No, I was kidding. It's, to what he was saying, it really is about talking to your audience. And I don't know a really nice way to say this, but really understanding if someone wants to hear what you're putting down. What happened to a lot of people, I think the pandemic was a big problem with that. Like, people are in their bubbles, they're creating stuff, and they have no editor. There's no one to help them know if that's the right direction they should go musically or creatively. And then also just to have some feedback from your community is so important. And I'm not talking just like running up to someone in the streets, like, what do you think of the song? I'm just like someone you trust, that you value their opinion, or just, family members, because they'll always tell you the truth.
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. I like my son always tells me when I'm doing something wrong, and it's great. It's like, keeps me honest.
Awesome. Well, folks, please put your hands together and thank these folks for being here today.